True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on. Hi, it's your host Claire Murphy, bringing you an update on one of Australia's most notorious true crime cases, the murder of British backpacker Peter Falconio. It's the case, you might remember, that inspired the Australian horror film Wolf Creek. Bradley John Murdoch was convicted of Falconio's murder back in December 2005. He was sentenced to life in prison. But now, there's been a significant development. Murdoch died of throat cancer on July 15, 2025, at the age of 67. He'd been diagnosed with the terminal illness back in 2019, and he was released from Alice Springs Correctional Centre just last month to receive palliative care at Alice Springs Hospital. But chillingly, his death came just one day after the 24th anniversary of Falconio's murder. Despite years of investigation and repeated appeals from police, Murdoch never disclosed the location of Peter Falconio's remains, and his body has never been found. In a statement following Murdoch's death, Northern Territory Police said, "His silence has denied the Falconio family the closure they have so long deserved." They went on to say, "Our thoughts are with the Falconio family in the United Kingdom, whose grief," they said, "continues." In this episode, originally published back in 2021, Jessie Stephens speaks with former Detective Superintendent Colleen Gwynne, the lead investigator into Peter Falconio's disappearance and murder, about the details of this case.
It's a Saturday night in the middle of July 2001 when Peter Falconio and Joanne Lees travel down the Stewart Highway in their orange combi van. Peter is 28 and in the driver's seat. His girlfriend, 27-year-old Joanne, is in the passenger seat. They've been in Australia for a little over 5 months, first arriving in Sydney on a working holiday visa. They'd come from Brighton in England, prepared for the trip of a lifetime. On June the 25th, the young tourists departed Sydney to embark on a road trip across Australia, starting in Canberra, then on to Melbourne, Adelaide, Darwin and Brisbane. The couple had been in Alice Springs and are bound that night for the Devil's Marbles, south of Tennant Creek. The road is long and the drive notoriously remote. You rarely see another car and the road extends as far as the eye can see, kilometres ahead. It's eerie. If you stand on the side of the road, it's so quiet and still, you're able to hear your own heartbeat. They had stopped at the roadhouse in Barrow Creek, but once they set off again, they start to notice something unusual. A car. They keep expecting the car to overtake them, but it doesn't. Along the expanse of road, a Toyota four-wheel drive with a large green canopy in the back approaches them. The driver gestures for them to pull over. Something must be wrong. There's a twinge of fear. They're alone, more than 15,000 kilometres from home. News had emerged recently in Australia and internationally of backpacker murders, with tourists like them disappearing in the Australian outback. They pull the car over and a man approaches them. And a few hours later, Northern Territory Police get a panicked phone call. I'm Jessie Stephens and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with former Detective Superintendent Colleen Gwynne, the lead investigator for the disappearance and presumed murder of Peter Falconio. You received a phone call one day from a young police officer who said that you better come into work because a bloke was missing and his partner said that someone had shot him. When you arrived at work, can you remember those early details of the case, those sort of first preliminary details that were coming out?
I remember it was about 11 o'clock at night and I got a phone call which was a little bit different to what you would get in Central Australia. Normally it's something more akin to, a bad car accident or something that had happened in a remote area. Someone needed to be airlifted. But To say that a woman had claimed that her boyfriend had been shot was very much out of the ordinary. So I got myself to work and it just looked really stressed and chaotic. It didn't seem to be organised. People were saying that there had been this claim and they were going to send some people up to Barrow Creek to interview this woman. But really, there didn't seem to be a sense of organisation and any sort of planning with the idea that this might be something that would turn into a major investigation for many years. So, yeah, not really what you would expect. And I guess when you see what happens over the following few weeks and months, I think that first 24 hours was critical and probably did a lot more damage than what we initially understood.
Can you describe for anyone who hasn't been to Barrow Creek and might not know that part of Australia very well, just what it looks like, what the feel of it is? Because we hear that it's very, very remote, but I think a lot of people don't quite know how remote this stretch of road actually is.
The stretch of road where the crime scene was, you can see what appears like kilometres ahead. It's just very straight, that area of road. And what you have is very hard ground, low salt bush. So you can see a long way from, if you stand in one area, you can see 360 around you. There's no hills. It's probably some of the remotest area in Australia.
The two people involved, it was Joanne Lees who had called the police and her boyfriend, Peter Falconio, had gone missing. They were travelling through Australia, weren't they? What did you know about their movements before that night?
Yeah, they'd spent quite some time in Sydney. Joanne was working in a bookstore. Peter had bought this combi van and he was doing some work on it, preparing for this trip through remote Australia. That was his dream, is to go through Australia and kind of sleep rough. And he wasn't interested in hanging around Sydney and nightclubs and living it up. He wanted to get out and wanted to go to places where no one else was around. And they'd saved for many years for this holiday, and this was their last holiday before they were to marry. So they had planned to then go on to New Zealand and on to other countries and then gradually make their way back to the UK and settle down and have kids. So they had invested a lot of money in this trip and had saved significantly for many, many years.
Where were they going that night when they were on that road?
I don't think they had a destination in mind at that point. They'd fueled up and then had decided to drive until they'd had enough of driving. They'd intended to come up to North Australia and then across to Western Australia. So, they had quite a long trip planned and they were planning to spend months in that combi van. That was going to be their home for the next few months.
When Joanne first did speak to police, what was her version of events? What did she say had taken place that evening?
Her story didn't change a great deal. There was some confusion in some of the detail, but basically her account was that her and Peter were driving along. At some point they realised there was a car behind them, and then that vehicle, which we now know to be Bradley Murdoch in his Land Cruiser, had pulled up alongside them and was pointing towards the rear of their vehicle as if to indicate that something was wrong. So at that point, Peter had pulled over and he got out of the car. Joanne was then asked to move over to the driver's seat and rev the engine. And what she then heard was a loud bang. Her immediate thought was that was the vehicle backfiring. But we now believe that was the gunshot, the fatal shot that killed Peter. She was then confronted by Bradley Murdoch. He appeared at the driver's side door, pointing a gun that she described at the time as a Western-type revolver. He pushes her over to the passenger side and instructs her to bend forward and put her hands behind her back. So Joanne, through this whole ordeal, she just fights for her life continually, and she refused. He then put a gun to her head and she subdued into compliance. She really thought that at this point he was going to kill her. He was going to shoot her in the head. He then tied her hands using the manacles that are now quite well known and talked about and forced her out of the vehicle. Murdoch straddles her and attempts to bind her feet, and she just starts kicking. He gives up. She's tough. She just keeps fighting. And he punches her to the side of the head, and he lifts her and frog marches her to the vehicle and then grabs her head and prevents her from looking around. So clearly she's at that point, she's looking for Peter. She's wondering where he is. So he deliberately forces her head forward and places her in the back of his ute. She's very confused at this stage. She's probably concussed. All of this has happened very quickly from the time that they first pull over to this happening. And she's calling out, asking Murdoch what he'd done with Peter. And he doesn't respond. She actually also says, "Are you going to rape me?" And at one point he opens the back of the canopy and he just says, "Be quiet," or he would shoot her. She realises that if she doesn't escape now, then she probably wasn't ever going to survive this. So she slips down the rear of the canopy, and as soon as her feet hit the ground, she runs towards the bush. She just runs. She doesn't really know what direction she's running in. So she hides behind a relatively small saltbush tree and curled up in a ball with her knees tucked under her chin, and then tried desperately to control her breathing. The fact that she was able to hide there was probably a miracle. If you've seen that area, she was very, very fortunate. After some time, she hears Murdoch start the combi and drive it north. He actually drives it off and hides it in the bush. And she listens really carefully, and she can hear the gravel crunching and something being dragged or hauled. She believed to be her boyfriend, Peter. She then hears the second vehicle start, then drive away. She's then left under that salt bush wondering basically what will happen next.
And how did she escape? How did she find anyone? Because, as you say, this is such a remote area. Did she manage to flag down a car?
So she sat there for some time. It was about 4 or 5 hours, because the biggest dilemma for Joanne is anyone that may come along that road might either be Murdoch or an associate of Murdoch. So once she heard what appeared to be the sound of a large truck, which we now know was a road train, she thought that that was safe, or more likely to be safe, to come out, and she ran out and flagged the road train down.
And so when she spoke to police and she's described this series of events, was she able to describe what the man looked like who had attacked them?
Joanne's initial description was pretty spot on. She describes him as a tall white man. She describes his hair down to quite remarkable detail, and she says that his hair kind of had bright flecks in it. And that was quite interesting for me when I had initially read that, because I'd never seen someone describe that in my years of policing, that someone had kind of these shiny patches in their hair. And I thought, well, maybe that's bits of grey that the offender had. It's interesting to note at this point, when I first met Bradley Murdoch, that's one of the things I noticed, that he had this little, it's kind of like his hair had this shine to it, and that's what Joanne noticed. So in terms of her ability to be able to pick up on such minute detail when she's under such enormous stress, shows what a remarkable woman she was.
When police received that call, they then went to the scene. Was there any evidence left behind from either the perpetrator or any sign at all of Peter?
What they find is blood that is on the road and on the verge of the road. But you can clearly see where someone's tried to cover that blood up by pushing the gravel from the side of the road on top of the blood that was on the road. But there was certainly quite a bit of blood there. And off to the side of the road, when you looked along the fence line, it was the combi van. So it was clear that that was the scene of the crime.
When Joanne came with her series of events, she was the only real witness who had seen this that you knew of. Was there any suspicion cast over Joanne herself in those early days, weeks and months?
The first few weeks of this investigation, if you look back in hindsight, there were some things that were done well, there were some things that weren't done particularly well. But in any homicide such as this, or suspicious murder or death, you've always got to keep an open mind, particularly if the offender is not evident immediately. Now, it's a valid avenue of investigation to look into the complainant or that person that is closest to the victim or the deceased in this case. And of course that they looked at whether she would have any motive to want to harm or kill her partner at that point. So was she a person of interest? Probably not, but did they keep an open mind and consider that she could potentially have some involvement? Yes, they did.
There was an early press conference where Joanne fronted the media wearing an unfortunate T-shirt. What did the shirt say and how do you think she came across?
Yeah, that's some footage that I often used in education for detectives, particularly around how to use the media to elicit information in relation to a major crime. Some real mistakes were made there. So Joanne obviously didn't have any clothes with her. So one of the things that the police initially did was to assist her in buying some clothes to get her through. And that shirt she chose herself and then wore in that very important first media interview. And, I think it probably wasn't the best choice in terms of clothing. And I think that's where the severe judgment of Joanne Lees first started. In these matters, the public will always be suspicious. They will always judge victims, and it happens time and time again. And we as police really need to ensure that we provide the best advice to protect victims from that sort of public scrutiny. And I think in this case, they failed Joanne in allowing her to wear a shirt that says cheeky monkey when she's pleading for the public for information that may lead to the whereabouts of Peter or the identity of the person or persons who have harmed him.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stephens. I'm speaking with former Detective Superintendent Colleen Gwynne about the disappearance and presumed murder of Peter Falconio. It was February 2002, that's about 6 months after Falconio's disappearance, when you were promoted to superintendent, which was the head of crime in Alice Springs. Where was the case at that point?
Externally, if the public were looking at it, it probably seemed to be that it was going through a progress of excluding persons of interest based on investigative avenues and process of elimination, going through what was thousands of lines of inquiry. But once I was promoted and I was assigned this investigation, I went through a process of actually just listening and watching and looking at what was going on with the team at the time. And it became really clear to me fairly quickly that the investigation lacked leadership and it lacked direction and it lacked any valid and thorough investigation plan that would increase the chances of identifying the offender in this. So, there were some things that I had to do immediately to try and, improve our chances of finding Peter, dead or alive, and finding out who was responsible. My first three priorities was to look at the team and understand who in that team actually was engaged and had belief in Joanne as the victim, and who was there for the right reasons and wanted to see this to the end. The other part is to look at the detail. And I'm not a details person by any means. I'm the worst person for detail, but I had to go into the detail. And I sat there day and night and read case note entry after case note entry to understand what they had done, where they were at, and really what direction the investigation should go into. And I started to set priorities. And one of the things I also did was to try and limit the amount of influence that the senior police had on the investigation. And my priority was to let the investigators do the investigating and they could get on with managing the police force. And that was probably one of the hardest discussions I've ever had with the Deputy Commissioner at the time. But to his credit, he accepted that and let us get on with doing the job.
You also chose a team who had varied skills, one of whom was renowned for being incredibly good with detail. A key to the case was the DNA found on Joanne's shirt. Can you talk us through the breakthrough that came from that and how you managed to actually obtain DNA that led you to this key suspect?
It's like any case now. Look, this is nearly 20 years ago and DNA was around, but it was still fairly new. So we had some DNA profiles. We had one on Joanne's shirt, we had one on the gear stick of the combi and one on the steering wheel. So we had a profile, but that profile didn't match anyone on our DNA system. If you think back 20 years ago, the national DNA database was still relatively new. So there wasn't the number of profiles that they would have now. And so we had the profile, but we didn't have a match. So we looked through our persons of interest, and one of them was Bradley Murdoch. Very early on in the investigation, he became a person of interest. And then as other things transpired, he became a suspect. And we needed to get his DNA, or close to. So we understood that he had had a falling out with his brother, and we needed to seek his consent for a sample for the purpose of analysis. So the youngest detective on our team was a very quietly spoken, articulate, and I thought that she was the best person to speak to Gary Murdoch. So off she went and spoke to him, and it worked. She explained our position that we were in and the fact that his brother was a suspect, and we were able to obtain a sample for the purpose of analysis. And once that came in, we knew we had our guy.
You say that Bradley Murdoch was a suspect. What did police know about him up until that point? Because he had been engaged in criminal activity. What was known about him and what brought him onto your radar in the first place?
When the investigation commenced, once I took over, there's one question I asked. Give me your top 5 to 10 suspects. If you got 10, great. Give me who you have. And at that time, Bradley Murdoch was second or third on that list. And so I said, right, what we are going to do is have a look at these that require further attention. And once we looked at Murdoch and we understood more about him, we realised that there was so much circumstantial evidence connecting him to this particular crime. One of those things was he was in Alice Springs at the same time. So to be in Central Australia when you actually live in Western Australia or you live in South Australia, that is an enormous coincidence. We then started to find out a little bit more about Bradley Murdoch, who would often go from South Australia to Broome, taking 5 to 10 pounds of drugs each trip, and he would do that in the vehicle that fitted the description that Joanne Lees had given. So we knew that he still had this vehicle, but he had made some significant changes to it immediately after this crime had occurred. The other thing he'd done is he'd completely changed his appearance. He'd shaved his hair, he'd shaved his facial hair off. His behaviours changed. He kept a much lower profile. And when we released the truck stop video, we had a phone call that the person in that video looked very similar to Bradley Murdoch. The final piece was the fact that his drug associate, James Heppy, was also talking about Murdoch as the potential murderer in this case. So things were starting to unravel for Bradley Murdoch, but the circumstantial evidence around him was just mounting up. And then when you add the DNA, you're pretty much there.
How did you eventually arrest him?
Yeah, well, this is another interesting coincidence. So during our investigation, I sought to get a criminal profile of the offender. Now, I had learnt a lot about criminal profiling and I was a big believer in it. And I knew there was a superintendent at the time in South Australia who had been FBI trained. And so she undertook a profile of the offender in this matter and had made some conclusions about who the offender is. And she was pretty close in terms of her predictions. It just so happened that during that time, between the time she did the profile and the time we started to actively look for Bradley Murdoch, that she was the district superintendent in charge of the area where he had committed another crime.
What was that crime?
So that was the rape and abduction of a woman and her daughter from a town in South Australia where he had abducted them. He had chained them to the back of his Land Cruiser ute and he had driven around with them for a couple of days and tormented and tortured them and finally letting them go. Then there was a manhunt for him and Superintendent Kilmeyer, who had done the profile, was in charge of that. And I'll never forget her ringing me and saying, "I think I've got your guy."
You met Bradley Murdoch in his cell, and we hear often that he is tall and quite dominating. What was he like? What was his presence? How would you describe him?
He's a big man. I can see why women would think him intimidating. He was quite erratic. He was angry, and he stood face to face with me in a room at Yatala Prison in South Australia. And I was with my male counterpart, a detective, who was an older guy, a bit of a bushy himself, but he wasn't interested in even looking at him. He just looked at me and he stood up close to me, close enough that I could feel his spit on my face as he was raising his voice at me and telling me that I had the wrong guy. And he tried everything to intimidate me. And we stood face to face for quite some time. I didn't take a step back. It became a game after a while, but finally he stood back from me and I got him to sit down and we talked for some time.
What did he say during that time? Was he still trying to convince you of his innocence?
Oh, absolutely. One part of this case that became quite controversial was the late release of some footage from the truck stop in Alice Springs. Now, the police at the time took a number of weeks to release that footage because they were trying to enhance it to increase the possibility that someone may recognise the car or the person in the footage, when in actual fact they probably should have just got it out there. So his focus was on that footage and saying that it's not me in your footage because I use the other pumps. And he pointed to the front of his teeth and said, "I've got no fucking teeth, so how could it be me?" His focus on that footage was quite considerable, but the whole time he was certainly arguing his case that he was innocent of what he'd been accused of.
You mentioned the profile that was developed. What kind of man was Bradley Murdoch and what were his motivations?
There's a number of things with Bradley Murdoch. He had a history of using violence, and generally when he didn't get his own way, he liked to be in control. Bronwyn Kilmeyer said this crime was committed with sex in mind. She believed the target was Joanne, not Peter. Peter was in the way, so he needed to be removed. There is some belief that maybe he had seen Joanne when they were both in Alice Springs. It could have been that he was at the Repco on the highway the same time that she was at Red Rooster waiting outside for Peter. Now, we know that she is the sort of woman that Bradley likes, and he may have decided at that point to follow her and pursue her. Now, that date, the 14th of July, is significant for Bradley Murdoch because it also signifies the day that he was married. Now, that marriage broke down and he was never had any contact with his ex-wife or his son, and he carried some anger and animosity about that. So we thought that perhaps that date had some significance.
You travelled to the UK to speak to Joanne, who was at this point pretty wary and distrusting of police after her experience. What did she tell you, and did you feel you were able to regain her trust?
The first morning was very difficult. She had never met me. She didn't have a lot of trust of the Northern Territory Police. She didn't have a lot of faith in the Northern Territory Police. And it probably took a good hour and a half, 2 hours to really gain that trust and to get her to open up. But once we did, it was a really productive conversation. She was able to explain certain parts of her statement which many were suspicious of, and some of the ambiguities were really just around the amount of stress that she was under at the time. Also, what became clear to me is that the initial police had tainted some of her evidence by introducing some influences in the first 24 hours. And what I mean by that is she said that Bradley Murdoch had a dog, and the police officer said, "Oh, was it a dog that looked like that one?" and pointed out a blue heeler. So by introducing such influences, it really taints their evidence and it confuses a witness or a victim, particularly when they've been under such stress. They can often get confused by things that happen immediately after an event that's caused that trauma. So there were some things that the police had really, I guess, tainted in the first few hours.
Another key piece of evidence ended up being a hair tie. Can you talk us through the significance of that?
Yeah, that was critical. So when we seized Bradley Murdoch's vehicle from South Australia and all his belongings, he was actually going to hide. He was going to hide in somewhere very remote, and we probably would have some difficulty in finding him because he knows those back roads like the back of his hand. He's driven up them all his life. He's been a drug runner. So we got him at a time that he had everything with him. So once we seized all his belongings and brought them to Darwin, we were about to go through a process of itemising everything he had and looking at what could possibly be evidence for the Northern Territory matter. And one of the detectives, who had this an amazing attention to detail, she said, "No, I think the best way for us to do this is one person spent as long as it takes and goes through it piece by piece by piece." And so she started dismantling the back of his vehicle, and what she found around his gun holster was a Lady Jane hair tie. And Joanne had reported that she'd lost it in the struggle. And we thought, is it a trophy? Why would he keep it, knowing that that would connect him to the crime? But there it was around his holster. And when he was shown that in the trial, he almost recoiled off the back of his chair because he realised that that was the last piece of the puzzle. So it was such a significant find in terms of the overall circumstantial case.
Did he ever confess?
Never.
And what was he convicted of in the courtroom?
He was convicted of the murder of Peter Falconio and the assault and attempted abduction of Joanne Lees.
Finally, I wanted to ask if Peter Falconio's body or remains have ever been found.
No, we have undertaken a number of searches. We've used experts from the UK. Whenever there is any information, the police act on that. That would be something just for the family, I know, would assist them. I don't think Bradley will ever disclose the whereabouts. I think he will take that to his grave. I guess, we feel quite proud in having achieved a conviction without a body, but to find Peter's remains would certainly add some real closure for the family.
Colleen Gwynne is a detective superintendent who led the search for Peter Falconio. She was in the police force for 30 years before reaching the rank of commander. It was during this time that she brought Peter Falconio's killer to justice. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stephens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.